We're going to talk about road cars. We're going to talk about race cars. This amazing display. And hats off to the staff of the museum for putting together a really just fabulous exhibit. With that, Rob, how did you get interested in cars?
I mean, that's like asking someone, how'd you get interested in girls? It started, I grew up in Scarsdale, New York, and then my parents bought a farm. I had 3 other siblings, and we had 2 foster kids, and my mother said, Scarsdale's getting too small for these guys. We got to get them a place where they can hack around with lots of rocks and trees, so then they won't be busting windows or getting into trouble with the cops. And when I was younger, it was just, the lawnmower always sounded better with the muffler off. And that's kind of where it started. We had, in Scarsdale, we had a neighbor that had he had a 51 Mercury. I guess I was about 8 years old. I was born in 46, so I probably was about 7 or 8 years old. This was a brand new, all white, with red interior Mercury convertible with Lakes pipes and a Continental kit. And when he pulled out of the driveway, the sound of that car and the way that car looked, and it had a California rake on it, so it really looked slick. And that kind of got me going. And it just was one thing led to another. It's just, it's kind of funny. I don't know a world without cars. I mean, they were more than just I actually liked washing my parents' car. And sometimes my parents' friends would come over and said, Rob does such a good job, could he wash our car? That kind of thing. And it was just a logical extension. I was mechanically inclined, it all just fit. That's about all.
Your first car was not that slick when you got it, but it's right here in this room with us.
Yeah, I'd gotten, when you watch The Untouchables, you see all these old cars when I was a kid, and I said, God, those things are really beautiful. Well, there was a neighboring farm that had in their barn that coupe, and it didn't look the way it did now, because the guys, over about an 8-year period, the guys in the shop restored it. But it was kind of my first foray into working on cars that I would subsequently drive. And we ran around the farm, and then when it came time to go from Millbrook, New York down to Scarsdale to go to school, when I was able to drive, we'd taken that thing down at the Conic Parkway, and boy, I thought it was like I was driving the fanciest car on the planet. And the first night we had it, I pulled it out of the barn, and I washed it off and everything, and I started working on it. When it became dark, I just kind of sat in it and went to sleep in it. I slept overnight in the car the first night I had it. But I drove it in high school. It was couldn't drive it at night. In those days, the rules were completely different on cars. You couldn't drive it unless you put sealed beams on it. I didn't like the way the sealed beams looked. And I really had nowhere to go at night anyway, so it was one of those things. But that was the first car. I'm pleased that I still have it. It's really I drive whenever I drive it. It's like back in my childhood. It's kind of a timeless part of my life, and I hope my grandkids drive it when they get able to drive. We'll put seat belts in it, maybe a roll cage. And I don't know whether we can do airbags, but they probably will want a radio.
You own a number of Model A's. This brown Phaeton here as well, touring car.
Yeah, that I bought from a friend of mine about 25 years ago, Frank Costello. You remember when we bought it from Frank? Frank Costello ran a printing shop, and he always came up with these cars. And he said, I need some money to buy some adjacent land. Do you want to buy this car? And I said, no. But then I thought about it. I said, geez, it's a pretty slick car. So we've gone through it extensively, right, Rich? I mean, And so but it's one of the favorites. It's one of the favorites for the family too. I mean, you can throw a lot of people in it and off you go.
How did you get interested in racing, and how did you become a racing driver?
Well, I think racing is kind of a logical extension of being interested in cars, I think. It's all part of the composite deal. That racing makes a regular car into something special. And I started following racing very early. I remember listening to Indy 500 in '56, and on the Speedway radio. And Pat Flaherty won that race, and I just said, Jesus, boy, what excitement! 500 miles, which took about almost 6 hours. And it was just a natural outgrowth of that. And one day I graduated from grad school. I didn't drive, but I worked on several guys' cars. And finally I said to my wife, let me try this just 1 year. I just want to see what it's like out there. And I bought a Datsun 510, which I don't have, but it surfaced later. But my younger brother built a replica of it for my 60th birthday and started running, and I won 2 division championships and a whole lot of races the first year. And I'll quote A.J. Foyt, who said that quitters never win and winners never quit. And so I just kept on racing, and then this guy comes along, and his sister comes along, and my wife was highly tolerant of my involvement in racing. But I did make a promise that I was never going to run an open wheel car, and I never did. I never raced an open wheel car. I came about that close to doing it once, but I didn't race anything in open wheel because I felt that there was some element of protection. So that's kind of what got me into it. I mean, it was just a logical extension of just being a car guy. I mean, if anybody coming in here would look at these cars and look at this car, which is a race car, and then look at the other cars and feel very comfortable looking at them, even if you're an aficionado of Bugattis or Talbots or whatever, Hispano Suizes, you can still appreciate the race cars. And that's just part of it.
Rob, you mentioned you almost drove an open wheel car once. I expect people would be interested in knowing a little bit more of the details about that.
I went down to Miami. My wife and I went down to Miami after in the old days we raced Daytona for 24 hours, then we did a 3-hour race in Miami, a street race, and then we did a 12-hour race at Sebring. Those were the first 3 races of the year. So you came out with 39 hours of racing in 3 races, and then the rest of the circuit started. We were running the Porsche then, and I did the Daytona race, and then I said about Miami, we had Price and James were running together. I said to my wife, let's just go down and be race fans. We'll sit in the stands and we'll just, go out to dinner and all that. John Bishop in those days would invite people out to dinner, and so on Saturday night it was dinner with the Bishops. And when we got to the track, I walked around and saw Foyt, and I said, who do you have driving with you? He says, nobody. He says, I was supposed to have Unser Jr., but he couldn't make it. He's doing Goodyear tire testing. I said, well, hell, why don't I do it? And he said, yeah, go get your stuff. So that's what started it. I've known AJ since I was about 16 or 17. And so we raced Miami, and I guess I did a good enough job that he invited me to come back and do Sebring with him. And I guess I did a good enough job then. He says, why don't you come and run at the Speedway? And I came about, well, maybe that close. I talked to Leo Mel about it. Leo Mel was the world head of Goodyear Racing in Goodyear's prime years of racing. And I talked to him about it because he would have been part of the support that we would have needed. And the first thing he said is, "Do you have the time?" And I said, "Frankly, I don't." He says, "Well, you got to spend the time there." The second thing he said is, "I just want to tell you that if anything happens to you at the Indianapolis Speedway, it happens at over 200 miles an hour." And that was in '87. And that was those cars they were getting safer, but you could still have your knees put up through your chest. And that alone said, maybe I've had a great career, maybe I'll just leave that as kind of the holy grail that I never could quite get there. And I'm elated that I didn't do it. I think I could have really gotten badly hurt. I would have gone to glory maybe, but it might have been on bad circumstances. So, but it was great it was an honor just to be asked, having that much faith in me to run one of his cars.
Rob, you made the transition from club racing to professional racing.
Well, I don't think it was that much of a big deal. I didn't think it was. After we won the championship in '81 and raced in '82, I said it's time to move up. And the Firebird just came out, and I said, "Gee, that would make a great race car." So I figured, I talked to Smitty and the guys. I said, "What do we want to do? Let's move up." So we built a Pontiac Firebird with a big V8 engine and started GTO racing. And the car was, I'm not even going to explain who built it, but the car was not really that good. But we learned an awful lot. And it turned out that at the end of the day, I said, what we were doing is, we're racing with the big boys, but we've got a car that doesn't meet our abilities. So I talked to, I said, well, let's take a look at this GTP racing. I mean, it's preposterous when you think about it. I mean, the whole thing was just nuts. I said, well, let's take a look at GTP racing, which was on its way up. And it was '83, '84 was when we raced several races in a GTO car. So I called, Bob Aiken and I were very good friends. Bob was a wonderful guy, a really terrific businessman, raconteur, and also a great race driver. And I said, Bob, I'm thinking of getting into GTP racing. He said, well, you should move up. And I said, I'm going to go over and take a look at the March cars. And he turned to me and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, look, Rob, nobody collects Marches. Let me introduce you to Holbert. I knew Al a little bit because in club racing, he had a car that was being driven by Doc Bundy. And I saw Al at the track and knew him a little bit, and he knew me. And Al worked a deal with Bruce Levin, who was going to sell a car and buy another car. And Al worked the deal out with Bruce, and Bruce and I bought the car from Bruce. And in essence, in the configuration that it is now, and they ran it for Daytona. They only ran about 7.5 or 8 hours. They had a wheel bearing failure. We picked up the car, brought it up here, and just started working on it. And we went testing a little bit, and then we were going to go race it. And we were shooting for Atlanta, but Atlanta was April, mid to late April. We weren't ready for it. We didn't have the pit equipment and all that, but we weren't ready for it. So our first race was at Lime Rock, and that kind of put us in, that showed the big boys that, 5 or 6 guys out of Poughkeepsie, New York could run with them, and that's what kind of started it.
In fact, you won that race.
Yeah, we won it. That was one of my guys said, Dewey Smith, Chris, said, why don't we retire undefeated?
Thankfully you didn't. What was it like being a car owner and a driver in the heyday of GTV cars?
Well, I think that it was a great era for IMSA racing. I don't know, it was just racing and just great venues and really great races. And the Porsche infrastructure was so good that you could always compete. And we were doing pretty well at it. We actually had a legitimate shot of winning every race, and that's the way I always looked at it. I always looked at every race that I ever competed in that I have a legitimate shot at winning it. And if you don't have that in the back of your mind, if you're going to settle for less than winning, you're not going to do the kind of prep job, you're not going to do the kind of driving idea or anything. And so it was just great. I mean, I got, lifelong friends and learned a lot, had great venues, and Watkins Glen is one of the long course at Watkins Glen in one of those cars, and Chris can tell you, and he will tell you what it's like to do on a prototype. I mean, it's just the greatest racetrack to race on, and especially in a car that you can really whiz around in. So it was again, it was a logical progression from a kid that looked at taking a muffler off the lawnmower and seeing that 51 Mercury. It's just a logical kind of stepping stone to be able to just pursue. That's all it was. It wasn't anything pulled out of the air. It was something that just one thing led to another.
As a car owner and as a driver, both, you won the Rolex 24, which is one of the biggest sports car races in the world.
I will tell you that I think, Daytona is a great race. I did 19 of them. Chris, how many did you do? 3, 4, 5? Four. It's it's a great race. It's a book that starts. It's a big, thick bound volume with blank pages. And over 24 hours, that big, thick book gets filled out with what happened. And that's true of every 24 hour. And it was a great race. We raced it in a Porsche. We raced it with the Riley. We raced it with that Ferrari Spice car that we were running, sponsored by Rain-X. And we were there a lot, but we never quite sealed the deal until '97 when we just lucked out. We had a piston that literally cracked from one side to the other, but it didn't go below the pin. It was just from above the pin all the way around, and we lost a lot of compression, but fortunately we were able to last. And it was interesting. This was the car that I was in with Elliott and John Paul John Schneider. And originally it was just going to be me and Elliott and John and Snyder, and then JP called and I said, sure, come on and drive with us. Well, Smitty, the first car broke with James, Andy, and Butch in it. So we all hopped in the car and everybody got a piece of the action. When we won at Rolex, said, wait a minute, we only give out three watches. And we said, hey, look, all these guys won it. Then after that, the next year, they put a limit on the number of watches that were given out. And also, IMSA established the event that you can have no more than 4 drivers in a top running car. The GT cars, you could have as many as you wanted because they figured those guys aren't going to win an overall win. And that was in the days when the only people that got Rolexes were the guys that won overall. So that was kind of fun, but everybody got a piece of the action on that one.
Chris, what was it like, though, growing up in a racing family?
Well, I don't know any differently, so it's a hard question to answer. It's interesting when Dad talks about the club racing days because that was really my earliest memories are of the Datsuns in our garage at our house with my dad and Pat Smith and Boz Pultz working on them, and it was always there. Dad was always competing. I mean, he would come home from a national race, and I always knew that he'd done well because I hadn't seen him the night before, but I'd wake up and the first thing I would do would be look under my bed, and the trophy would be there. And more often than not, they were first place trophies. So, you know, from a very early age, I kind of realized that, like, when you go racing, you're going to compete, and you're going to win. And I think racing has this, probably perhaps more than any other sport, it has a unique osmosis. You know, you see a lot of second-generation athletes, I think, in baseball. But you see more in racing probably than anything else, and I think the main part of that is that it's a sport that kind of transcends age. I know it's kept Dad young, it's keeping me young. It's a state of mind, and I think it's one of these things that, because the pursuit is so exciting, and because the objectives are so outlandish, and frankly the whole premise, when you think about it in this day and age especially, of being able to go around at unrestricted, high speed, maximum noise environment, and it's encouraged. It's surreal, but it draws you in, and from an early age, I was captivated by the excitement of it, the speeds, frankly, the competition. My dad was just, you know, he set a lot of benchmarks for me as far as detail and preparation and frankly the humility. I mean, you hear him talk now about some of these amazing achievements, and I mean, what an amazing role model for me to have accomplished so much, and just to be so humble about it. And I think that just the fact that he was able to keep getting the opportunities. I grew up and the sport was a ever-present part of my life and of his. It's very important to the family. It's obviously our identity is tied up intrinsically with the race team, and I never felt any pressure from that because I loved the race team. I mean, if I wasn't going to drive for it, I was going to work there. And in fact, when I was a very young teenager, I mean, one of the first Daytona races I went to was in '93. Randall Kelsey, who later became the team manager, and I were just there bussing tires around, 14 years old. It was great, but I love everything about racing. I love the shared camaraderie. I thought it was a place where, as a kid, the paddock was a wonderful place to be. It really boosts you up, you know, to have adults talk to you at that age. And that was one of the things that I always liked about it, was that you could go to the track and, you know, I mean, these titanic figures now, particularly retrospect, just hanging out with them and just looking them in the eye and shaking their hands and just the encouragement that you get, the way it lifts your spirits. I don't think there's anything else like it. And I think that the sport continues to kind of keep itself interesting and keeps drawing people in, because when you're part of the paddock and when you're there, it's one of the most exciting, self-supporting groups that you can ever be with. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why Dad and I just enjoy it so much. So, and I feel like that it fills you with a sense of energy that you can take out into the world. And that was one of the things that I always liked about it.
Did you just always assume, Chris, that you would someday race yourself, or did it come slowly?
So I never really assumed it. I think, you know, I loved racing and I loved being at the track, and obviously with Dad doing it, you always wonder from a young age, boy, I really would love to be out there. I mean, particularly when you're going out to Elkhart Lake and you're watching the GTP cars go around, or Lime Rock in a Camel GT weekend where people are lined up for an hour outside waiting to get in, and then, you know, the first lap by and the cars come down the hill. I mean, you just think to yourself, what would that be like? But it wasn't ever anything that my parents encouraged. I think Mom was probably going to be mortified. Dad did a good job of not doing everything in his power to kind of not push me into driving. I gravitated towards it just organically. I think some of the stuff that I did was kind of crazy enough that Dad finally settled and said, okay, we're gonna actually get you a proper racing car now, because we had these field carts that we were driving around Randall's house and we almost killed his brother. That's a long story, but it got to a point where I was blowing up engines and we were spending too much time in the shop fixing a bunch of crap that we were gonna go out and run around in fields and probably hurt another neighborhood kid. And Dad finally said, all right, you guys need to go to the racetrack now. And I think from the time I started go-kart racing, you realize how hard it is. You realize what it takes. It's not just a passive thing. I mean, you get out there, it's not just, especially, the IKF oval go-karts. Back then I was old enough when at the time I started, I was 15 when I actually started racing, which was quite late actually, certainly compared to a lot of my peers. And I was racing against grown-ups. So it was, and Dad wasn't going to be out there to hold my hand. It's a stand-up and stand-alone thing. But I came from an athletic background. I played a lot of baseball, played at a high level. That was probably my primary sport. Had things been different, it might have been my only sport. But I'm grateful I got the opportunity to try it. I got interested and loved it and started having some success. And much to Mom's consternation, I'm still doing it now, 28 years later. So, but no, it was never inevitable, but in the back of my mind, it actually probably was, even though Dad and Mom didn't know that.
You started out in club racing in a spec racer Ford, less than 100 horsepower, and you made the jump to sports racing cars. How big an adjustment was that?
Mount Everest. I mean, it was incredible. I still can't believe he did it and gave me the chance to do it. It was, I probably couldn't have gotten a bigger sort of confirmation of my dad's trust and confidence in my abilities and in my intelligence than to have put me in a car that was literally light years ahead of the cars I'd been racing. But I think that I'd been doing well enough on a national basis with the spec racer Fords, which were really competitive and great racecraft. And honestly, some of those guys that race those cars are still to this day some of the best guys I've ever raced against. But in terms of raw ability in the machinery and what I was required to bring to the table, not only physically, but just the ramp up in performance and anticipation, it's kind of staggering. I mean, I at the time, like Dad, he talks about this progression from the 51 Mercury to GTP, and he treats it like it was kind of just a progression. I think at the time, because it was what I wanted to do, and because it was where I wanted to go, in my mind, I was absolutely ready for it. I was also 23 years old. So, at that age, there's nothing that's going to stop you. And we had a teaser and a taster of it. Again, another wild one. They were doing a Goodyear tire test up at Watkins Glen in '99. I think I'd done 4 races, regionals in my spec racer Ford, and they let me take the car out. And needless to say, that was really eye-opening. Going up through the S's the first time and just pulling gears, 156 miles an hour through the S's, and I guess I went well enough in that test. I think my lap time probably would have put me in the top 10 for the 6 hours. And I think everybody was kind of like, wow, we should actually maybe think about this. So a couple years later, we had had some success and done a lot of racing in the national championship. And Dad said to me, he said, why don't you come up to Watkins Glen and we'll get you in for some test sessions. And I went out and went quick enough that I think that Elliot and Dad talked and said, yeah, Chris should be racing. And I think when I came in, I was running 3rd. It was surreal. I mean, it was just, again, that osmosis thing of, in your brain, you imagine it your whole life of like what this would be like, what it could be like, and then all of a sudden you're doing it. So even though a lot of guys who were racing there had gone through a lot of feeder series and gone through a lot of ladder series and had a lot of pedigree, I think that my desire to do it was so strong that I rose up to the occasion, and I'm just thankful that Dad gave me the chance to see if I could get there. In retrospect, I had to backfill a lot of experience, and I did so the first few years, but my desire was there, and it had been such an important drumbeat of my life that when I got the chance, I think I rose to the occasion.